You're listening to The Observing Eye. Pirate radio for the mind. Coming at you fresh from the computer hell cabin.
Hello, you beautiful lot. It's Friday, the 22nd of September, 2023, and this is episode 31 of The Observing Eye. If you're new, welcome aboard. If you're returning, welcome back. As always, I like to begin these episodes with a brief moment of reflection. So, let's take a few moments to contemplate the good things that have happened this week. And now a moment for the not so good. If you followed along from last week, you'll know that this is episode 2, part 2, I should say, of my series on the cult mindset called A Cure for Wellness. In last week's episode, we talked about some of the techniques and devices that cults use to manipulate people and to get them on board, to keep them under control. And we talked about some examples of cults in the past and how they've operated and the tragic outcome that most of them end in. In this episode, we're going to be looking at something slightly different, still on the cult theme, but we're going to be talking about the dangers of the cult mindset in modern society and ways that we can combat cult mindset thinking in ourselves. Plus, of course, as I promised, there'll be that little story of when I visited the Church of Scientology and what happened there, so that should hopefully pique your interest. In that vein, there are two aspects that I would like to discuss in this podcast today. One is the cult of celebrity, and the other is the cult of the self. Now, it was Andy Warhol who said that in the future, everybody will be famous for 15 minutes. And it's this phrase that essentially coins where we are now with the cult of celebrity. The influence and the following and the power that people have who are famous, who are in that celebrity circle, the influence that they have on us as, and I count myself in this wholeheartedly, ordinary human beings going about our day, whose window into that world is, the black mirrors that we hold in our hands, the Instagrams and the Facebooks and the TikToks and the Snapchats and all of the other channels that we have access to them via. They are a window into another world in which these people exist. And it's not entirely dissimilar to our, historically, the myths and the gods of the old world, the Greeks and the Romans. For example, we've always had mythology. We've always had these figures that we would look at and revere and idolize, in a sense. And we've got that now, but in a slightly different vein. We've replaced Perseus and we've replaced Achilles and Hercules and Poseidon and all of those lot with Rihanna or Katy Perry or Taylor Swift, or even people like, notoriously in the news as of this episode, Russell Brand, for example. Now, these people, much as the gods of old did, they exist in an elevated space, kind of ethereal, in an otherworldliness. They operate via different rules, and we look at them in very much a similar way as we looked at the old pantheon, the old characters from mythology that fundamentally occupied a similar space back then. Now, I am in no way saying that there is anything wrong with celebrity at all. I'm not criticizing it. It's a part of our society. It always has been a part of our society. The issue that I want to bring to your attention now is that with the ease of access of ways in which we can publish ourselves, the democratization of channels in which we can put ourselves out into the world for fundamentally an infinite audience, if the algorithms deem that our content is worthy enough, it facilitates this conflict between getting attention and paying attention. Now, the problem is that when we do things under the guise of getting attention, we fall into the trap of landing on the hedonic treadmill, of consistently chasing the next thing on the horizon that will fundamentally never appear and will never satisfy us when it does. We are looking at the external for some sense of validation of self and identity. And in my mind, this is not a sustainable or healthy way for us to seek value in our lives, in our existence. Paying attention is a much more internal, introspective process. It brings us into the moment. And for those of you that have followed this podcast before, you'll know that I'm a Buddhist and I've been studying that for a long time. And we are all about the internal. Paying attention is us being present in the moment, in the action of doing. Unlike the getting attention mindset, the focal point of us doing the work, doing whatever creative endeavor we're involved in, is not around gaining attention and approval of others. By paying attention, the satisfaction comes from the internals, comes from the creation itself, comes from the thing that we have manifested into the world. You know, I've talked about this before, the word psychedelic. We associate psychedelic with, drugs and LSD and shit, man. But the word psychedelic means the mind made manifest. And to me, the act of paying attention in the creative process is fully the mind made manifest. We are taking something from our imaginings and we are building it into the world. We are projecting the inner thoughts of our mind out into the external. And that is a really, really powerful thing. And I believe that only comes when we create through paying attention, not getting attention. So I feel like the danger of the cult of celebrity, the danger of the democratization of the channels in which we can put ourselves out into the world, we can publish the content, we can be, this creator of content out in the world. It changes our perspective of it. It changes the angle that we look at creation, and we fall into that trap of, I want to be famous, into the trap of getting attention rather than the act of creating, of paying attention. Now, keeping in a similar vein, I want to move on quickly to the cult of the self. Now, I feel like there are two main factors which have facilitated the cult of the self. And by the cult of the self, I mean the focal point on individualism. So as human beings, we are naturally tribal, communal animals. But we have moved into a space where a lot of that has been left behind, much to our detriment, I feel. But a lot of that's been left behind because of the way that we can work, can communicate, can maintain connections over distance, thanks to the power of technology. And again, technology is an amazing thing, and I will in no way criticize it. I work in it every day, so I wouldn't criticize that, bite the hand that feeds me. But off the back of this very rapid change in our culture, two things have fundamentally arisen out of this. We have social media and we have the burgeoning and ever-growing self-help industry. What I would say is the commoditization of wellness, and not in a positive sense. So social media tells us, or shows us, I should say, shows us snapshots of aspirations of what we could become, of the things that we could have. Again, throwing us back on the hedonic treadmill. The self-help industry tells us how we can always be a better person, how we can always be more, do better, work harder. And I say that with a deep sense of irony, considering the nature of this podcast and me talking around the self and psychology and philosophy and trying to be a better human being. But I try not to lump myself in the self-help category. Tell me otherwise, please. There's Instagram, there's a comment section. Come and tell me I'm being a massive fucking hypocrite, and I'll take that on board. But both of these factors, they focus our attention on the self and how we should be better, the dreaded shoulds, right? The danger of that, when we become really enamored with the self, is that we tend to lose perspective of the grander whole, the wider community. Excessive focus on the individual, on us as an individual, can lead to things like narcissistic behavior, a lack of empathy, and fundamentally damage our mental health, our self-perception, who we think we are. I've talked about this plenty of times before, but, going back to Carl Rogers when he talks about cognitive dissonance and how we have the ideal self, which is the image of the person that we think we should be, versus the actual self, which is the person who we perceive that we are now. When there is a big difference between those two, a distance between them, it creates all sorts of conflict and issues within us. We wish we were this person, but we feel like we can never get there. And it's all self-worth and all kinds of stuff starts coming into it. And it causes a right royal fucking mess. We end up getting into this sort of dangerous territory where we confuse self-love with self-cherishing. So self-love is great. It's looking after ourselves, right? And I've said this before. I'm repeating myself a lot in this episode. When focusing on our own well-being is not a selfish act. Because when we look after ourselves, when we attend to our own mental and physical well-being, it enables us to have the capacity to tend to the physical and mental well-being of others. It enables us to be of valuable service to others. Self-cherishing, on the other hand, is a slightly different animal. And I feel like it's exacerbated by a lot of this self-help sort of shit and social culture that we see on social media. Self-cherishing is where we care for ourselves so much that we feel a sense of entitlement to our wellness, like we deserve it. And not just our wellness, but our success as well. It's an overinflation of the ego, a grandiose sense of self-importance. And it can be easy to blur the lines between recognizing self-love and self-cherishing when we are bombarded by what I would consider to be this self-help fallacy, essentially. It can confuse the issue. How do we combat this? How do we recognize and combat this within ourselves? Unsurprisingly, as we've talked about the cult of self and the cult of celebrity, the techniques to challenge these ideas within ourselves are very, very similar to the techniques that I spoke about in the previous episode on challenging cult mindsets when you find yourself confronted with a cult evangelist. And those are practicing self-awareness, challenging some of the thoughts and motivations that are going on. We can use Socratic questioning for that, which is where we challenge the perception with fact, and utilizing an aspect of self-inquiry. So things like journaling can be really good. So we can note down our motivations and our emotions and what's going on with us and come back to them as a point of self-reflection later on to see how we've changed and to question some of those things a bit more objectively when we aren't inside the moment of the experience themselves. A bit of an overview there on the cult of celebrity and the cult of self. And I hope there was something in that you could garner for yourselves or that you found useful. Now, for the pièce de résistance, the dessert at the end of your entrees. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the experience I had when I visited the Church of Scientology in London. And we can talk about that because I think that will give us a really nice rounding overview of some of these sorts of mindsets in action. So I'm not going to reference names. I'm not going to specify where this was. But essentially, walking down a street in London and come across a little sign out the front of the Church of Scientology, which we were just passing. And the sign said, here's a free entry to our museum. And I've always been intrigued by Scientology. I've always been intrigued by the mindset behind it. So me being me, thought it would be a good idea to venture inside and to experience the free museum in the church. So I enter and we're both asked to fill in these forms with all sorts of personal information, which I'm initially a little bit sketchy about anyway, but they were very ecstatic, I think is the word, to have two people, probably the only two people of the day that have come in to look at their museum. And we were ushered up these elaborately ornate marble stairs to an upper mezzanine, which had an incredible giant carved sextant and wood-panelled walls, and it was absolutely crazy. And then someone came out and moved us into this sort of small library with a number of videos and books that were written from the angle of Scientology, so books on education. And I don't know if you know anything about Scientology's view on education, but it's very different to the one that I imagine we are all familiar with. So there were some videos on L. Ron Hubbard. He was the science fiction author who founded Scientology, and some really fantastical claims about the achievements of L. Ron Hubbard in these videos. I was very impressed, yet slightly questioning. So we spent a bit of time in this library looking through some of the books, just thinking, wow, this is really something else. Just to get into this and experience it. And after about 10 minutes or so, a person has come into the room and they've said, oh, I could see that you were reading the education books. Would you like to discuss a bit more about Scientology's view on education? Now, bear in mind that at the point that she entered the room, we were not reading the education books, and there was no one else in the room. I realized that we were clearly being observed from some Scientology control room out the back. What then ensued was a rather challenging conversation with what I can best be described as a wide-eyed enthusiast who was pressuring the pair of us to be split up and taken into a back room to fill in a questionnaire, which, when she explained it, was clearly a very complex psychometric test. And once that psychometric test had been completed, we would be asked to wait in the room whilst two trained Scientology psychiatrists would come and interrogate us individually in isolation to see how Scientology could help us. Now, the person I was with wasn't as well versed in Scientology as I was, so before we entered, I said to them, if any mad shit goes down and they try to get us into a room, we have to say that we have to leave now because we are meeting friends for dinner. Now, the person sort of laughed at me and was like, don't be ridiculous. But when they tried to get us to split us up and get us into those little glass rooms with the Scientology psychiatrists, what's the first thing that person said? Yeah, sorry, we have to go now. We're meeting friends for dinner. And you can see there's some interesting tricks that they were trying to employ there to isolate and separate us, to get us to fill in a psychometric test so they can understand our weaknesses, and then to put us against two psychiatrists or psychologists who could then use the information that we've given them in the psychometric test, essentially telling them all about ourselves as a means of manipulating us into joining up the church. That's how I see it. Okay, that may not have been the fact, but, as a psychologist and as someone who is fairly well versed in this stuff, that is exactly how it smelt to me. And I tell you, I could not get out of there fast enough. And that's it for today. As always, thank you for joining me. I appreciate and am grateful for you choosing to spend your time here. I hope that there's been some interesting stuff in this episode. Next episode, we'll be going back to our usual formatting, where I'll be talking about something that I think might be useful for you from a philosophical and psychological point. Generally, it'll be something that I've stumbled across in the week that's garnered my interest. And as it's Friday, I always like to take a moment to wish you all a fabulous weekend. Do not stumble into the Church of Scientology's Open Day Museum this weekend. I may have inspired you, but please refrain. If you are interested in going to visit something to do with a cult this weekend and you're around London, I would, however, highly recommend a trip to the Temple of the Cult of Mithras, which is underneath the Bloomberg building in London. Really interesting experience if you ever get a chance to go down there and you're in that neck of the woods. Anyway, that's enough from me. Wishing you all a restful, relaxing, rejuvenating, restorative weekend. As always, my friends, much love, and I'll catch you soon.
You've been listening to The Observing Eye. Thanks for spending some time with me today. I hope you found it useful. And if you're interested in any more of my writings or work around psychology and philosophy and general day-to-day living, please go and take a look at my Substack, which is theobservingeye.substack.com, and that's I as in the letter, not I as in the gelatinous organ through which you see. Take care, everybody. Much love, and I'll see you soon.